It says you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. So Joel, I think that means.
Okay, let's try it again because I thought I just stopped sharing.
Okay. Are we?
Yep, looks good.
How about that?
Even that's showing us your notes
Okay.
section. So I think it's the.
Yep. We'll switch it.
Yeah.
All right, we just did this successfully. Why is it okay? Just it's taking away the menu that I used before.
Huh.
There it is. Okay.
There you go.
All right. How about that?
There you go. Perfect.
Does that work?
Yep.
Okay. It's a funny look on my side, but that's fitting because I'm also a funny looking person. So thank you very much for the invitation here. I think the way we became connected was that I have been working with the Pacific Northwest inventory and monitoring crew to try to help provide them support for this rising problem of exotic annual grasses and wildfires and restoration, which from my perspective is pretty much ground zero when it comes to improving or increasing climate adaptation for our semi-arid upland landscapes in the Western United States. So the area that I'm talking about, let's talk about like, what do we mean by semi-arid landscapes in the Western US? So here's an aerial map. And for our colleagues in Africa, especially who may be a little less familiar with what we're dealing with in the Western United States, the Department of Interior is by far the largest landowner of the surface area in the Western US. Our pointer going here. And we've got the cold deserts in this area that I'm circling right here, which have cold winters, snowy winters, and very hot, dry summers. These areas are dominated by these areas are dominated by sagebrush steppe. Sagebrush steppe, by the way, is the most widespread vegetation type in the Western United States. And it's also the most imperiled, and it's also the topic of my research and this presentation today. The other deserts that are relevant here are the Colorado Plateau, which occurs on the iconic sandstone types areas down in here, also has sagebrush. The warmer deserts here, the Mojave, is where sagebrush grades into blackbrush and greasewood. Blackbrush ecosystems share some of the very same problems that I'm going to be describing today for sagebrush steppe. And then you get down into the Sonoran Desert, where they're also having some, this is where you get the iconic tall cactus. And they're starting to have some of the very same problems with invasive grasses and wildfire that I'm going to be describing today. So I'm going to be focusing on sagebrush steppe that is occurring in this Pacific Northwest quadrant of the United States, but know that what I'm describing is relevant to other areas of semi-arid areas of the Western US, and actually a lot of other areas globally. We're starting to hear from people in places like Chile. I've seen some scenarios in South Africa that resemble what we are dealing with here. So here's our starting point. This is an increasingly rare view of intact sagebrush in the, actually near where I live in Idaho. And here you can see this shrub, sagebrush. This is a remarkably versatile plant that has endured many thousands of years of climate variability over time in its range. And it also spans a really wide range of climates. This species grows in areas that have as little as 140 millimeters of precipitation per year. That's just a few inches. And it also grows in areas that get over 500 millimeters of precipitation per year. And if we look at the paleontological records, if you core sediments in the ponds or in some of these areas, and you look at the pollen from sagebrush going back thousands to 10,000 years since the last glaciation, you can see that this species was present and very abundant during wildly different climates. But what we're observing is that sagebrush is being lost from these landscapes, and that loss is corresponding with increases in temperatures and shifts in our precipitation regimes. So a couple of other points. Why is big sagebrush so versatile in its climate? Well, number one, it has dimorphic growth properties. In other words, it's got shallow roots that can utilize fresh rains. It has deep roots, which allow it to use winter rains during the hot, dry summers when there's otherwise very little rain. It has, again, both evergreen leaves as well as drought deciduous leaves. And this species has sculpted the diversity of both the plant and animal, and also microbial communities around it. So we consider it to be a foundation species. In between the big sagebrush here, you can see what are bunch grasses and bare soil. While that bare soil actually, by the way, is probably covered with biological crusts. Here's a photo by a very artistic person, Nolan Priest, of a landscape that not too long ago we know looked just like the previous photograph. This is the Ruby Mountains of Nevada. Here what you're seeing is the exotic annual cheatgrass, which comes from Eurasia and has come to dominate landscapes like this. This landscape has undergone a state transition from native perennial into exotic annual grasslands. Now, when I think of global climate change, the fear and loathing, the specter of climate change impacts, what we're showing here is the worst case scenario. In other words, under global climate change, if we see more, we don't want more of this type of transition to literally no value landscape. Actually, I take that back. Some ranchers have learned to get a little bit of value grazing cheatgrass, but the impacts of cheatgrass on ecosystems are unacceptable by nearly anybody's definition. So how does this happen? Okay, so here's a picture of big sagebrush steppe. And again, all the elements: sagebrush, bunch grasses, and other forbs, bare soil, and some biological crust. Cheatgrass is pretty good at invading these interspaces, especially when livestock have eaten away some of the perennial grasses, which otherwise match cheatgrass's growth requirements. And then the area burns, and after the wildfire, cheatgrass has a selective advantage, so it increases. And you get the fire cycle. So this is more likely to burn, and you're more likely to have progressive loss of these native perennials. Big sagebrush is very poorly adapted to fire. It cannot resprout, and it does not form a good seed bank, and its seed dispersal distances are very short. So we know that large frequent wildfires surely did not occur in the evolutionary history of this species. And so you get this feedback where cheatgrass gets in, creates more fire, and is favored after each fire, and progressively that grass-fire feedback gives you the state transition. Now, the other major vegetation change, this is happening over large areas. The other major vegetation change is how managers are responding to cheatgrass. One thing that is going on, for example, is using agricultural implements in these otherwise wild landscapes to plant or seed perennial grasses that we think could best compete with cheatgrass. And here, for example, in this fenced area, you can see rows of perennial grasses. This happens to be crested wheatgrass, which rains from Russia and is pretty well adapted to the area of concern, and it grows here. And so this is kind of this management response in a way is a secondary impact. It's sort of it's a way that managers have redirected this damage that they were unwilling to accept and so they've redirected towards an intermediary, tolerable, but less than ideal vegetation condition. What they would really like to do is resist the change and maintain these intact sagebrush landscapes. So Gregor, I saw that you're on the call here. I'm using some of your language. I'll come back to that in just a second. So anyways, these impacts, I think, are ground zero for climate shifts. This worst case scenario in our semi-arid deserts. The cheatgrass, we've done a lot to show that the invasion is, we've heard about desertification in places like Africa. Well, I want our African colleagues to know that the same thing is going on here in the US. It looks a little bit different, but the difference is that we don't have as much recognition that, yes, all these landscape changes are desertification. Desertification is, in my mind, the worst case scenario for global climate change impacts. Loss of productivity per unit rainfall, loss of the habitat, diversity loss. We have species like greater sage grouse, which are now very much threatened over huge areas, very problematic. The fire hazards, people die in fires, the smoke is terrible. After wildfires, we're seeing massive wind erosion events that look like the Great Dust Bowl within small regions, hugely impactful. And then there's many other ecosystem services which are being greatly infringed upon, which most notably a loss of carbon sequestration that we otherwise see in sagebrush steppe. So that's why we're focusing on this. And I want to acknowledge again these new decision space concepts that we are trying to reframe the kinds of work that's always gone on in sagebrush steppe, and to help communicate about them. So I talked about how we can resist, accept, or try to direct the plant community changes. Another concept that's coming up here is, wow, we really need to prioritize where we put our restoration actions. Again, those restoration actions are the critical way in which we can adapt our landscapes to climate change. One concept is let's defend the core areas which are still intact and prevent them from being degraded. Or let's find areas that we think we can restore and grow the core back, increase the amount of intact area, or mitigate. There's more I could say there, but let's move on. So here's some maps to show you the extent of the problem. Sagebrush steppe, again, very widespread. It once occupied about 1 million square kilometers in the Western US, and now there is less than half of that habitat type still around. The rest of it's been converted. So lots of wildfires, and the map of that wildfire area corresponds really well with the map of exotic annual grasses. This is mainly cheatgrass. These maps are generated from satellite imagery. So the changes are readily viewed in space. That's how big and extensive they are. And again, you can see the loss of sagebrush perfectly corresponds to that fired cheatgrass. So what are we doing about it? For many years, land managers have applied some pretty heavy-handed tools. The drill seeding, using agricultural implements to actually drill seeds into the soil, has been very common. Aerial seeding of sagebrush, using herbicides, and these have now covered many millions of acres. But some recent estimates or recent efforts to assess the success of these treatments points a fairly negative picture. In other words, these treatments haven't worked. They haven't solved the problem to date. That's stressful because if you look at what some interagency assessments have done for our prospects, they've tried to figure out where are the opportunities to preserve sagebrush, where can we grow more, where are the threats lie. If we intersect those, we can figure out where we need to act, where we need to defend, where we need to grow, mitigate, etc. How much acreage? According to Kevin Doherty of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and his team, we're looking at about 30 million acres that need treatment, which really comes down to us needing to treat about 1 million acres per year. So we're up against a massive need. If we want to make these landscapes, if we want to do what we know will be useful for minimizing the cheatgrass fire cycle and leveraging the remarkable climate resilience of the native perennials, get them back on the landscape, we're looking at this as our main need, in my opinion. And again, these are the tools. By the way, I forgot to mention, One tool we have is passive, and that is alleviating the landscape from livestock grazing. We're seeing this is increasing a little bit. We're working with Fish and Wildlife Service on areas that they've just pulled cows off of, removing livestock grazing, even though we know livestock eat the perennial grasses, which allow cheatgrass to enter. Removing cows doesn't necessarily mean you're going to solve the problem. This is something we're also looking at around protected areas, including Park Service installations. And here's some photos of the different tools I described before: herbicides, seeding, massive areas, drill seeding, fairly heavy-handed techniques, but the problem's severe. So now there's so much area to treat, and we probably will never have enough resources to treat 1 million acres per year. So then the question is, where should we treat? And here, climate enters the equation big time. So here what we're showing is resilience to disturbance. In other words, the ability of the landscape the vegetation to rebound naturally after fire or other disturbances. And that relates very much to the resistance of the plant community to invasion by cheatgrass or some of the other exotic annual grasses that are trying to invade. These two are related. One way that they're related is that they both link to the abundance of resprouting perennial herbs. And here what you can see is a gradient of climate going to the right, cooler and wetter, different habitat types along the way. And what you see here is at the very highest elevation, unsurprisingly, cool and moist, the vegetation can rebound pretty well after disturbance. It also is pretty resistant to cheatgrass, owing to cheatgrass's climate requirements, but also the vigorous growth of the native vegetation. The other end of the spectrum, down here in the Wyoming big sagebrush, where most of our fire and invasion problems lie, there's very low resilience. Well, the thought is that up here, you probably don't need to intervene because the landscape can recover on its own. Down here, if you're going to intervene, you better be ready to spend a lot of your resources and spend them over and over again year after year if you hope to see any success. These areas, in a lot of cases, have been considered salvage. That intervention is less likely to result in a positive outcome. And therefore, it's these intermediate areas, these intermediate climates where a need for restoration is present and a likelihood of success after the investment is reasonably good. So that's what this resistance resilience paradigm has done for us. And as you might imagine, people like John Bradford of the U.S. Geological Survey have done a lot of climate modeling to project how the soil temperature and moisture conditions, which are generally used to predict the climate here, map out under future climates. And the obvious is what as you might expect, the obvious situation is that there are fewer areas in the future that have these climates and more that have this. Another colleague, Bethany Bradley, has done a lot of work with climate envelope modeling of cheatgrass. And all the climate models suggest that cheatgrass is very likely to expand in the future. And sagebrush is expected to contract. So other things here, we've made a lot of advances in assessing the effectiveness of these restoration treatments. The previous data that suggested restoration treatments have not worked very well was based on plot level measurements. So the researchers might go out to 100 different wildfires across the Great Basin, and they might sample 3 small plots per fire, giving them many hundreds of plots of data to work with, but that's a few hundred plots compared to millions of acres of inference. Just in the last year or so, remote sensing models combined with some statistics have generated much improved real-time vegetation maps. We've leveraged those recently to reassess how well these treatments are doing for us. Here, for example, you can see treated and untreated burned areas that, for which we obtained some fairly reliable remotely sensed estimates of sagebrush cover. And these fires occurred over many decades. What we realized is that first of all, the treatment applications, where managers chose to put their treatments, actually happened to have been in some of the harshest spots, areas that were, this is probability of receiving seeding, relatively dry areas and relatively warm areas. So managers were picking the hardest spots. And if you didn't consider that in your analysis, then you might have underestimated the success of the treatments. So our improved ability to understand, use remote sensing and available climate models is actually changing our perspective on just how successful these treatments might be. Better than we thought. That's actually good news. This is just published 2 days ago in Nature Communications. Here's another thing. For decades in the United States, the managers were required, if they had a large wildfire and they wanted to do some restoration after that wildfire, critical intervention point for breaking the cheatgrass-fire cycle, they had 21 days after the fire to propose for emergency fire money for which to do their restoration. This includes the National Park Service, by the way. And boy, that's hard. If you have a large wildfire, sometimes 200,000 hectares in size, uncommon, fairly common to have fires that large, really hard to do. Furthermore, they were given that money and given a very short 1-year window to put their treatments in. Well, you can just imagine, what are the conditions that lead to fire? Drought. How long does drought usually last? Usually longer than 1 year, typically multiple years. So the fire happens during a drought and the restoration interventions are made during a drought. Is that a recipe for success? Definitely not. How are things changing? Well, just since 2015, the Department of Interior here has changed the direction by which post-fire management and all efforts for the cheatgrass fire cycle are done. They want to see adaptive management, and so don't all the practitioners. We know that we need to have a longer window with which to intervene. We need to do treatments, observe the outcome, learn from them, and make follow-on treatments and continue that adaptive management cycle. This is such a fresh thing happening here in the Department of Interior. Here's one very close to me that I've worked on, 2,000 monitoring points across this landscape where we made lots of treatments in an area that was once nice sagebrush, burned, highly threatened by cheatgrass, lots of repeated interventions. Each one of these follow-on treatments was informed by what our USGS crews discovered in all these plots. Where was the cheatgrass, increasing or decreasing? Where could we use more restoration? Here's another cool thing. With improved documentation, we're able to learn a lot. Where do you get sagebrush seed to seed a 115,000 hectare area that's burnt? Well, that seed is wildland collected. It comes from far off places. How can you, one key thing for restoration is matching the climate of seed origin to the climate of the seeding site. Easier said than done. Here, what you can see are these strips that hopefully, let's see, it says my computer's about to restart. You can see these strips where these different seed zones, seedlots were flown. Here, for example, is a strip that came from central Washington. This darker color came from central Utah, for example, from far off areas, different climates. This was, you can see here that these are crossing hills, so high elevations, low elevations, so not a perfect match of seed source to seed site. But something really important was learned from this. We look at the climate of origin, you can see that the number of sagebrush recovering was greater for those seed sources which came from warmer and wetter locations. This is a great example of assisted migration, unintentionally working to improve restoration on this landscape. By the way, the sagebrush recovery, the ecosystem recovery on that whole soda wildfire has been quite a bit better than in previous wildfire areas. A little bit more on seed sources. So talking about climate adaptation, let's get the right seed at the right time in the right place. seed climate zone information is what we need. And it's hard to get for wildland plants in places like the Western US, and I'm sure in places like Africa. So one way that we can generate better information here in the US, we collect the seeds, we plant all those seeds, collected from different climates, different areas into common gardens. Here you can see some of the plants from different populations have died off. Some have grown really large, some are small. We take all the information, do some statistics, and we create these seed zones, these seed transfer zones that can be used. You need digital tools to make that information available to land managers, to restorationists who usually have a short amount of time and a limited budget to figure out where they're going to, where, when, and how they're going to get their plant materials and resources for doing climate smart restoration. The Seedlot selection tools allows, this is available, you can see this on this website and play with it. It's super easy to use. You pick a point and then you say, well, here's my lat long. You pick the climate scenario that you want to work with. You can use the last 30 years or last 100 years. It'll do the climate simulation for you. Whether you want to use nominal or customized seed transfer zones. If you have a particular species in mind and we have the seed zonation for it, you can pick it, otherwise generic. And the climate variables that you think are important. Degree days, precipitation, whatever, you add them in. And here, so for example, I also set a constraint that I wanted the seed for this area of concern to be within about 70 miles, or I'm sorry, what is that? About 200 kilometers. And here are the available areas for which this software suggests I could collect the seed to seed this one particular site shown here by the blue marker. So it's just an example of the type of tools that we use. More on the right seed. The key thing here is that it's not just picking the right population. It's a lot of times, you know, we think that we're planting native plants, but often seed vendors are selling us cultivars. Okay, those cultivars are raised on farms, and there's genetic selection that occurs during the farming of those plants. A lot of times those cultivars are selected because they reproduce well, they're very growthy. Are those the best biological traits for really harsh sites that are warmer and drier and hotter and more stressed out? And, you know, again, we're using non-native seed sources. There's a lot of controversy about that. One thing that we're observing over our continued analyses over these large areas are that in the short run, you might see that the non-native or cultivar mixes establish relatively well, but in the long run, we're seeing some evidence that the native mixes might be prevailing. And that's exactly what we'd expect if climate adaptation were a major issue. Other key questions are, should we be looking at importing different species like blackbrush that normally grow, I told you grows down here, should we be planting that in the sagebrush steppe? These are really pressing questions. A little bit more on ecological drought, and I'll wrap up here. So we looked back at all of these different sites. We now have available to us some very resolute information on soil water availability. Key thing if you're dealing with climate change in the deserts. We can simulate the actual soil water potential, which is not just the water content, but the water availability. So we looked at many hundreds of different past wildfires, figured out which ones had sagebrush present recently, you know, like after decades, which ones didn't. Did a little bit of statistical modeling, and I'm sorry, we found out that that the burned areas that had successful sagebrush recovery had a really seemingly subtle better window of soil temperature and moisture after wildfire. It's kind of like, you think of it like a keyhole of climate, of weather that allows sagebrush back in that landscape. Here's what it was. In the year following wildfire, if you had 1 week longer with soil water potentials above some certain level and temperatures above freezing during that one extra week, that was enough to give a site sagebrush, or if you didn't have those conditions, the site wouldn't have sagebrush. Really remarkable. So Small-scale water deficits create long-lasting ecological impacts, ones that are very relevant to climate change. Under climate warming, those conditions, that keyhole window of moisture and temperature probably is going to be a little harder to find. In the short term, though, managers can use this information to try to hedge their bets when they deploy seeds onto the landscape in ways that will improve success. And towards this, we've taken the information and created a module in a website software that's known as the Land Treatment Exploration Tool, in which, again, the managers will pick their polygon or their point in the landscape, and there's all these resources which can be used to tell them the past success of seeding in similar areas, and to get really good information on historical, current, and forecasted soil temperature and moisture. In my estimation, this is a massive leap forward in providing climate smart information to improve restoration. There's so much more I could say about this, but I know I'm running along. So this drought module, I encourage you to take a look at it. Here you can see what the science tells us about the soil water conditions that lead to sagebrush presence after a fire, or no sagebrush. And then here for a particular point is what the weather simulator, which is taking the very best climate forecasting information and downscaling it, and then translating that information into soil water content. Here's the moisture that you're expected to have available for a particular site. Here's the estimated probabilities of establishment. So manager could say, well, I'm going to hold off on seeding, or I'm going to go ahead and seed based on this information. So let me wrap up. In conclusion, hopefully I've made a strong case that, and I could have shown you maps of how sagebrush steppe is supposed to change with climate forecasts, and we can talk a lot about that. But what I'm emphasizing is that we really need to focus in on these vegetation shifts. We already know that we have a problem with the cheatgrass-fire cycle, and all aspects of that are very much linked to climate shifts, and therefore it merits our attention. We've got to preserve those native perennials that we know are robust and able to endure. They've proven that they can endure a lot of climate variability. They just can't endure the climate variability in the presence of anthropogenic stressors like the combination of grazing, cheatgrass, and fire. And these digital tools are super useful. I encourage our colleagues from Africa to take a look at them and reach out to me, and I can talk to you a little bit about them. And let's see if we can't get tools like this available for places like where you work, instead of just having them for the Western US. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I'll probably run a little bit long. And I think you said you wanted to have questions at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you for excellent presentation. A couple of things. One, I would request that people start putting their questions into the chat, and then we will have a longer discussion section at the end of the next talk. And Matt, could you also put some of the links to those various online resources you just mentioned? Could you put those in the chat as well, so people have them? That was excellent. Again, people, please enter your questions so that we can bring them and address them after the end of the next talk. And with that, I want to go ahead and introduce the next speaker. So today we have a joint presentation from Dr. Moto Masubelele and Avevuzani Phophe. And so let me give you a little bit of background here as we go. Dr. Masubelele is a landscape ecologist with South Africa National Parks, where he focuses on habitat change, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and land use change in the Cape and Arid Cluster National Parks. His research interests include climate change impacts, vulnerability, adaptation and mitigation of biodiversity, cultural heritage, tourism, and socio-ecological issues, including indigenous peoples, in and around national parks. He earned his PhD in botany and plant biology from the University of Cape Town. He has certificates on climate change and terrestrial ecosystems from the University of Bergen in Norway, and a certificate in climate change adaptation from Oxford University in UK. He represents SANParks on various national committees on climate change adaptation, such as the EBA Steering Committee, and land degradation, such as the LDN Target Setting Committee in South Africa. He is joined today by his colleague Avuvuzani Phophe, also known as Pauline. She's a junior landscape ecologist with South Africa National Parks under Conservation Services, where she focuses on carbon sequestration and land restoration in arid parks. Her research interests include climate change mitigation, land restoration in national parks, carbon footprint assessment and carbon storage in ecosystems, all of this driven by supporting the goals of climate mitigation within the organization, as well as linking her work to national and international mandates. She earned her master's at the University of the Western Cape and leads 2 climate change mitigation projects within SANParks. Firstly, documenting the carbon footprint of the organization and quantifying carbon sequestration in Tankwa Karoo National Park. She represents SANParks on various technical working groups at DEF on climate change and air quality. And we're running into some video technical challenges, so we're going to go ahead and give this presentation, but we are unable to see Momoto. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Momoto, if you want to do the screen share, and we can get going.
Joel, it says I cannot share. Because the other participant is still sharing.
Can you try that again? Because I just stopped my sharing. So it might just be a lag. There we go.
Seeing anything?
Yeah, so we're seeing like the slide edit window. There you go. Perfect. Wonderful. And I see that you got your video working. So fabulous.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Because yeah, I've just changed my laptop. I had challenges with my laptop. So this is like an old hard drive that they've put on here. And this function has not been working, the video function. So yeah, okay.
Fingers crossed. So.
All right, thank you. So I will give the talk about Budzani. It will not be talking, but she will be supporting in terms of the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So as Joe highlighted, I work for South African National Parks, and I'm based in Pretoria, where the head office is, and I've had the privilege of sitting in 3 of our 4, actually 4 of our 6 sort of offices where we have conservation services people. And I will be talking about the restoration work in terms of how we report to the national government. Then I will go into some of the focus areas that we report on. Then I'll give some case studies and examples of the research that we do in our national parks. So SANParks spread across the country, and it's 20 national parks. We are in 8 biomes. So the bigger focus would be on essentially the impact of drought and desertification on our national parks, and with a lens specifically focusing on examples in the arid region. And yeah, this is according to the UNCCD, what drought is and what desertification is. There are different types of drought in terms of hydrological, agricultural, and so forth. So the arid systems are often having major challenges when it comes to desertification, and this phenomena has increased basically more recently. And so we report to the National Department of Environment specifically under the UNCCD convention. And some of the challenges that the work we do try to address include biodiversity loss, extreme poverty, and so forth. This is map just showing the challenge we face across the country when it comes to drought. These are some of the presentation from map produced by the Agricultural Research Council in a recent report that they developed for the Department of Environment, essentially. And what they show is the areas that have experienced severe to extreme drought between 2014 and 2021. And you can see, like, when you zoom in, that some of the municipality where our parks are experiencing a drought of more than 11 to 15 months, basically. You look at the Namakoi and the Kruger, Ado, some of these areas have recently experienced like severe droughts. So our parks obviously are hubs for biodiversity, but also for the people that are close to our parks. The ecosystem services that are generated within our parks and beyond are very important at the, obviously, at a biome level. We face different challenges depending on the type of biome that one is sitting in. For example, in Ado, managing number of elephants is important in terms of how it impacts on biodiversity and vegetation change, basically, in the area. I will present one example of a PhD work been done in Ado on carbon sequestration. And then for our arid parks, such as West Coast and Namakwa, managing disturbance for the purposes of flowering, which is a major tourism attraction for the park, is also one issue that we deal with. So I just wanted to highlight here how broad this challenges across the country that we face when it comes to dealing with land degradation and restoration, as well as climate change. So our constitution essentially mandates us to make sure that everyone has a right to an environment that is not harmful to their health and well-being. If you look within the constitution, it is clear that things like pollution and ecological degradation needs to be dealt with and conservation be promoted. But while we do that, we have to do it in a way that is justifiable economically and socially, because South Africa is a country that faces a lot of challenges when it comes to poverty. So we have these programs that are our parks through a group called the Biodiversity Social Program that employs people around our protected areas to do this ecological intervention. So these are jobs for youth, for women, for people with disabilities, and a lot of small, medium, micro enterprises have been developed around our parks, basically, that put in the interventions that we prescribe as the scientific services. But we work in close collaboration with the National Resource Management at the Department of Environmental Affairs. So one key challenge in the program is that the ecological function part is not often reported on. So the two variables that they report on is on, excuse me, the presentation keeps moving forward, but the key ones are essentially the two areas that they report on is the hectareage, the size of the hectareage that they have cleared or restored. And then they also report on the various social metrics, but not a lot on ecological function. So in 2019, we developed the SANParks Degradation and Restoration Framework. This is a framework that guides us in terms of how we implement land degradation and restoration in our national parks. And it's really at the core balancing that socioeconomic development issues and environmental sustainability. Within the National Action Plan, these are the outcomes that we report on. The first one on policy and institutional framework, effectively implemented to strengthen and minimize desertification, reverse land degradation, and mitigate the effects of drought. So these are some of the policies that we implement in our national parks. And I've already alluded to the land degradation and rehabilitation framework. The SANParks strategy also, we do vulnerability assessment across our parks. So far, I think we have done about 7. So we'll continue to do this until we can manage to do all of our parks. I'm not sure, maybe in the previous talks, Nicola might have presented some of the work around our park level vulnerability assessment. And then more recently, we've been developing the climate change preparedness strategy. That really guides at a higher level how we implement climate change and then essentially link up to the nature-based solutions. The second outcome is on research. So I'll give you an example of research that's been done on land function analysis in the Namakwa National Park, but there is various projects that are ongoing, and that's I think as an opportunity, that's a huge resource for us to think about ways of how can we use all this across different regions to put in climate adaptation and mitigation actions.
What? Your makeup? Oh, you have lost your privilege for having your makeup. Oh, absolutely not. I'm on a meeting. Go.
And
I'm on a meeting.
The third outcome, which is outcome 7, is on reporting on this land degradation neutrality targets. Across our national parks, like I said, we have this hectareage that we report. And in terms of LDN, there's 3 main indicators that you report on, which is land cover change. The second one is landscape productivity using NDVI. Then the third one is soil organic carbon. So nationally, there's a huge challenge in terms of reporting on soil carbon. There's a few organizations that are implementing work on that, but for us, especially as SANParks as well, we need to jack up on the soil carbon analysis segment. We do have projects that are ongoing. Wendy, my colleague Wendy Foreign, is supervising a student who's looking at carbon storage across the parks. And we have these other examples of projects wherein I'm working with Ababutani and another PhD student, Tokozani from Stellenbosch University in Ado, basically. So there is opportunities to get all this work packaged in a way that, because initially the research or the implementation was not designed for climate change adaptation or mitigation, then we have our hands full in terms of taking all this work and making it relevant in terms of our climate change adaptation and mitigation actions. So in terms of the land degradation neutrality, so in terms of the LDN, I've already reported on the indicators. And then these are the targets, national targets that we contribute towards. So you can see it includes this. For us specifically, we don't contribute so much to the first one, but the other ones on forest, fynbos, grassland, succulent, and wetlands, and clearing of invasive aliens, bush encroachment, all those ones, we play a very important role nationally in terms of contributing to these targets. Within the organization, there is, within our annual performance plans, it is clearly highlighted that we have to report on the number of degraded hectares of land under rehabilitation. We must also report on the wetlands under rehabilitation. So those are the actual performance from 2017-18 going to 2020. And if you look at it, you can see that when COVID started, then the performance just dropped drastically because obviously people could not go out to implement some of the intervention, but also financially, the COVID put a strain in terms of the amount of funding available to do this intervention. As you can see, for all of the other ones that I've mentioned, the targets on clearing fynbos, managing grassland, we contribute quite a substantial chunk basically to the national target. If you look at the table below, like in terms of total relative to the national. So we're reporting here, there's actual follow-up on some of the sites that have been done, and then the key one is where we're putting in exactly new interventions. And then you can see the hectareage basically for alien clearing, it's quite substantial, followed by bush encroachment or managing in our savanna biomes. It's largely bush encroachment work. For the succulent thicket, we are actually we've been able to contribute about basically 20% towards the national LDN target. So we're estimating that by 2030 we need to have restored about close to 30,000 hectares basically of the succulent karoo. So we will do this for all the other biomes, and the associated social benefits from the implementing some of this work. It's clear that the number of SMMEs, the number of beneficiaries goes in line with the intervention. So if we're not doing intervention, our big concern is that the SMMEs, the people around our parks, will obviously experience more poverty. So we need to start coming with alternative ways of accessing funding, especially in line with things like ecosystem-based adaptation, where we can work with national government and the National Resource Management Unit to set up programs that will help. But also, what is key is to investigate all of these interventions that we've put in place. How do they contribute to our parks when it comes to reducing the impact of climate change on our parks and people in close to our parks. So the organization have been developing this the climate change preparedness strategy, and these are the pillars that guides how we're going to intervene in terms of climate change, preparedness, mitigation, adaptation, and then as well as how we help communities near our parks. So those are the three main ones that will have reference in this talk. I've already alluded to this process. Here, I just wanted to emphasize that we've done park level engagement where drought was identified across the parks as a major challenge. Within the climate change vulnerability assessments at the park level, some of the adaptation actions that we are proposing is putting in research, but also investigating, how, interventions such as reforesting or restoring ecosystem will help. And as part of developing some of the carbon markets, basically, for our parks. And then when it comes to adaptation, one intervention that is key is implementing nature-based solutions, basically. So I've talked about many challenges that the parks face. Some of them is at a species level, and in some instances at an ecosystem level. So this is the Richtersveld region, which is closer to Namibia. What we've seen in that region is that more recent increase in strong winds have led to desertification, increasing sand and dust storms in the area. So it's a recent phenomena that was picked up by park management, but more importantly, we did a separate project working on community-based adaptation, where the community highlighted the challenge of these to their livelihoods, but also to infrastructure within the community. One other challenge that we picked up at the Richtersveld was that this is according to colleagues, is a climate signal, in the fact that within the park, we are seeing this loss of some of the succulent species, like this species called Alu personae has been basically declining in the park, and it can be attributed to this desertification within the park. These are some of the messages that were communicated from the park colleagues who started witnessing these changes that have been happening. And if you can imagine, this is a highly biodiverse area, highly biodiverse desert, is a global biodiversity hotspot. So we need to put in interventions to deal with climate change within our parks. In the previous slide, you can see the colleague who communicated has set up a biobank in terms of some of the seeds. He's been planting within the nursery storage for seeds for some of these species if it gets to a point where we have to take some of the saplings basically back into the field. Those interventions have not been done yet, but there's potential to do that as well. But being in an arid region, obviously water might be a challenge. We've been in contact recently as well with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, who have developed this concept on scaling up ecosystem-based approaches basically to deal with climate change disasters in vulnerable regions of South Africa. So there's an opportunity again here to work closely with the National Resource Management team. And there's value because we have this data set of interventions across the different national resource management programs in terms of alien clearing, bush encroachment, and dealing with land degradation, ecosystem degradation in our parks. So under objective 3, you've alluded to the work that Babuzani does on green energy in terms of measuring a carbon footprint, but we need to do a lot more now in terms of understanding all these intervention that we've put in for restoration, its value for carbon sequestration within our parks. In some instances, we have like the new park, which is called the Eastern Cape Grassland Park. Gives us the opportunity to test different model where we work with private landowners and to increase the size of the conservation estate. So all these biodiversity, nature-based solutions can be worked with these different landowners. There's also an opportunity to identify some of the markets, carbon markets, towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We haven't done that work, so we'll have to start doing that kind of research. There is some parks where they are starting to pilot it. Addo Elephant National Park, I know through park management that they're working closely with some of the universities in the region, basically to develop some of these carbon markets. Here's an example of the work that Babuzani did, basically in the Tango Karoo National Park. Here, she went into areas that had been previously cultivated and were within the park for close to 16 years. And what she picked up was that in terms of soil carbon, the cultivated landscape had more soil carbon than the near natural areas, basically those areas that were not cultivated within the park. So this clearly highlights that we incorporate a lot of landscapes into the park that might take quite a bit to restore biodiversity, ecosystem services, as well as add value in terms of carbon storage. So we really need to, think carefully when we put intervention or incorporate landscapes into the park. Especially more recently, there's a trend for biodiversity, for going for biodiversity offsets, and in some cases they come with a lot of land that is degraded or full of alien invasives, and the process of getting back them to a level where they add to biodiversity and all these other ecosystem services will be a while, and it will take a lot of resources. So we have to think carefully around those issues. Another example of a study done by Thokozani at Stellenbosch University. He used remote sensing data. Here I'm presenting some of the land use data over the years. This work essentially links up with the LDN setup. But what Thokozani is doing further is to look at exclusion areas for where elephants and large mammals are not allowed in the park, versus where we've done restoration, as well as areas where animals are allowed, to see what is the impact of mega herbivores on carbon storage within the suckling, within the thicket biome, basically. So what he's been able to show is that over the years, there has been an increase basically in some of the ecosystems that you find within the park. So he looked at the whole park expansion area, not only in the park, but he also looked outside of the park. And there was a huge dam basically in 2014 in terms of the thickened land cover. However, that declined in 2018 and 2020. And then one other key landscape within the area is the shrubland of Namakaru that covers large areas outside of the park. So that has also been in the increase. What concerns me mostly is the fact that when you look at the wetland areas, there is a 35% basically decline in wetlands within the park. You know, the previously 1990, in that region, we had about 2,001 hectares of wetlands, but it went down to 796 hectares and then further declined to about 609 more recently. So some people have done work in the region. Anthony Mills and his team, I think they are called C4 Eco Solutions. They have done some work and tried to pilot some of the, carbon market formulas, develop some formulas and things like that. And they were able to show within, some of the intervention were done within ADO. They were able to show that if you closely pack a speckbone, which is Pochilocallia afra, which is a very unique plant in the region that is able to store huge amounts of carbon. And if you plant it in a way, closely packed, it creates a positive feedback basically for infiltration. And they argue that this is comparable to many temperate and tropical forests, basically in terms of the rate of carbon sequestration. So there is definitely potential for earning carbon credits for some of those areas, and we have to think about ways to develop those. However, some people have cautioned against these markets, that we have to really look at them in terms of their value for recovery of ecosystem services and improving restoration success. So there's a huge drive globally in terms of reforestation, and in our ecosystems, especially our grasslands, fynbos, we have challenges with some of these invasive trees that are planted in these ecosystems, or in some instances, it's just our natural trees that are responsible for bush encroachment. So this planting of trees across the country would present us with a challenge. So what these authors clearly highlight is the fact that there is some, ecosystem-based interventions such as reforestation, river restoration, wetland restoration, as well as natural, fire regimes that will help in ecosystem mitigation in our ecosystem, as well as ecosystem-based adaptation.
Mamoto, sorry to interrupt, but we're at the top of the hour and I know a number of people are going to start leaving. So, oh, you're on your last slide. I will stop and let you wrap up. There you go.
Yes, in terms of just concluding, I just wanted to highlight the fact that, yeah, we do quite a bit of restoration, and there is opportunities and challenges when it comes to repackaging this work for climate change adaptation and mitigation. There is a need to, as an organization, we need to review, because I feel like if we're gonna implement at a landscape level, we need to work beyond our protected areas. And our protected areas, I see them as valuable for monitoring and evaluation, especially as benchmarks for landscapes outside of our protected areas. Some of the frameworks that Matthew presented, I think I found them very useful, that will help us in terms of prioritization for these adaptation and mitigation purposes. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mamoto, and I appreciate your persistence in some of those technical challenges. I know people are going to be cutting, having to head out to other things. Just want to remind everybody that the next session is in August on transboundary collaborative conservation. And to today's speakers, a great appreciation for your presentations today. I think there were a number of points that were raised in the chat. I think what I'll do is, given the time, is email those send an email to the speakers and the people who raised the questions, and have you guys address those questions offline if that works for you. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, you can find the recordings, you can find the listing of past webinars and a way to access the recordings on the Resilience Hub of South Africa. And I look forward to seeing you all in August. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.